Welcome back to part 2 of my examination of what I saw at the Calgary Military Museums. In part 1, I drove to Calgary from my home in Edmonton, Alberta, and looked at the exhibit of armored vehicles on the exterior of the museum building. This time I will take you inside to have a look at the various military museums housed inside the building. When I acquired my ticket at the reception desk, I asked what I could and could not photograph in the building. I was told photos were permitted in any of the museum spaces except the PPCLI Museum at the request of the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry, and so I will not show you anything in that museum. When you first enter the building, you cross over a bridge over the first exhibit space, the Fall of 44. On one side of the bridge, you look down on a Sherman Tank, and on the other, an armored reconnaissance crew looking over a map on the hood of their Willys Jeep. The Fall of 44 exhibit commemorates the last phases of the Second World War in Italy and France, where Canadian troops were involved in intense combat. The exhibit also highlights the mutual support the infantry and armored regiments developed, where the infantry protected the tanks from German troops armed with anti-tank weapons such as the Panzerfaust, which posed an extreme danger to the tanks. The tanks supported the infantry in return by closing in and engaging hardened enemy bunkers and strong positions to allow the infantry to close on their objectives. From the Fall of 44 exhibit, we will now move on to the Museum for the Lord Strathconas Horse Royal Canadian Regiment. When you first enter the Lord Strathconas Horse Museum, you come upon a display of Sir Donald Alexander Smith, a wealthy Scottish businessman who was created Baron Strathcona on the 23rd of August, 1897 as part of the Diamond Jubilee Honours for Queen Victoria. He was Commissioner, Governor, and Principal Shareholder of the Hudson's Bay Company. He was President of the Bank of Montreal, co-founded the Canadian Pacific Railway. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba and afterwards represented Montreal in the Canadian House of Commons. He was Canadian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom from 1896 to 1914. The exhibit recreates the famous photo of Lord Strathcona driving in the last spike on the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway. During the Second Boer War, from 1899 to 1902, Lord Strathcona became concerned that the Boer commandos, many of whom were on horseback and were therefore highly mobile, were inflicting too many casualties on the British military. He realized the cowboys and frontiermen he had seen in Western Canada would be better suited for combat on the vast South African veldt than the infantry. In 1900, at his own expense, Lord Strathcona raised and equipped a mounted regiment recruited in Western Canada, and by April 1900, the Lord Strathcona's horse arrived in South Africa, where it was used for scouting ahead of the British Army. The next display in the museum is devoted to the heroism of Sergeant Richardson of the Lord Strathcona's Horse. Arthur Richardson was born in Southport, England on the 23rd of September, 1873. In 1894, he immigrated to Canada and joined the Northwest Mounted Police. When the Second Boer War broke out in South Africa in 1899, Richardson went on leave from the Mounted Police and enlisted in the newly formed Lord Strathcona Horse Regiment. The citation for Sergeant Richardson reads as follows. On the 5th of July, 1900, at Wolf Spirit, about 15 miles north of Sandringham, a party of the Lord Strathcona's Corps, only 38 in number, came into contact and was engaged at close quarters with a force of 80 of the enemy. When the order was given to retire, Sergeant Richardson rode back under very heavy crossfire and picked up a trooper whose horse had been shot and who was wounded in 2 places, and rode with him out of fire. At the time when this act of gallantry was performed, Sergeant Richardson was within 300 yards of the enemy and was himself riding a wounded horse. For his act of extreme gallantry, Sergeant Richardson became the first Canadian serving in a Canadian unit to be awarded the Victoria Cross. The next exhibit tells the story of Lieutenant Frederick Harvey of the Lord Strathconas Horse. Frederick Harvey was born in Ireland in 1888 and immigrated to Canada and settled in the Medicine Hat, Alberta area in 1908. He enlisted in the Canadian Army in May 1916. Lieutenant Harvey was awarded the Victoria Cross following an incident on the 27th of March 1917 at the French village of Guyancourt. During an attack by his regiment on the village, a party of the enemy ran forward to a wired trench just in front of the village and opened rapid fire and machine gun fire at very close range, causing heavy casualties in the leading troop. At this critical moment, when the enemy showed no intention whatsoever of retiring and fire was still intense, Lieutenant Harvey, who was in command of the leading troop, ran forward well ahead of his men and dashed at the trench, skillfully manned, jumped the wire, shot the machine gunner, and captured the gun. His most courageous act undoubtedly had a decisive effect on the success of the operations. In addition to the Victoria Cross, Lieutenant Harvey was also the recipient of the Military Cross and the French Croix de Guerre. Next, we come to a display of the main armored workhorse of the British, Commonwealth, and later American forces in World War II, the Sherman Tank. Nearly 50,000 of these tanks were built and first went into action in 1942 at the Battle of El Alamein, and were withdrawn from service with the Canadian Army in the early 1950s when they were replaced by the Centurion tank. The next exhibit is of a Lord Strathcona horse trooper cooking lunch on his Ferret armored scout car that was used by the Canadian Armed Forces for reconnaissance from 1954 until fully withdrawn from service in 1981. The Ferret began to be replaced by the Lynx armored vehicle beginning in 1968. From the 1950s to today, one of the major roles of the Canadian Armed Forces is to supply troops as peacekeepers to the United Nations, where they have served in several areas of conflict throughout the world. The next exhibit is of a corporal with the Lord Strathcona horse in the role of a UN peacekeeper. He has on the blue UN cap to show he is a peacekeeper and is driving a quarter-ton Jeep painted in the UN white paint scheme. Of special interest to me is what he has sitting on his passenger seat, the SMG C-1. This submachine gun was the Canadian variant of the British Sterling submachine gun and fired the 9mm Parabellum pistol ammunition. When I was in the militia in the late 1970s with the SALH and the 15 Edmonton Service Battalion, this was the weapon I was most commonly issued when on exercise in Wainwright or Dundurn, as its compact size made it more practical for use in a cab of a vehicle. We will now leave the Lord Strathcona's horse and move to the next regimental museum in the building, for the King's Own Calgary Regiment. On the day of my visit to the Calgary Military Museums, several senior groups with walkers were getting a guided tour of the facility and were in the King's Own Calgary Regiment Museum when I got there. I didn't want to get in their way or interfere with their enjoyment of the museum, so I only took one photo in there. I meant to go back later, but never did. The photo is of the exhibit of a Churchill Tank exiting a landing craft during the Dieppe raid on the 19th of August, 1942. On this raid, several Churchill tanks, including those of the King's Own Calgary Regiment, were included. This was unsuccessful as the tanks either exited into too deep of water and sank, or could not get good traction on the beach sand and either dug themselves in or broke their tracks. Though unsuccessful, the Dieppe raid provided many lessons that the Allies used to make D-Day a success 2 years later. Someday I'll have to come back and give the King's Own Calgary Regiment Museum a more thorough look. But for now, it is time to leave behind the museum for the King's Own Calgary Regiment and head over to the museum for the Calgary Highlanders. In the Calgary Highlander Museum, we will see some exhibits of their roles in World War I and World War II, then their part as peacekeepers for the United Nations, and finally, their role in support of the government in Afghanistan. It is now time to leave the Canadian Army behind and move on to the Navy with a visit to the Naval Museum of Alberta. It might seem strange that a landlocked province like Alberta would have a naval connection, but Alberta contributed many sailors to the Navy over the years, including my uncle Petty Officer John Fleming in World War II. The Naval Museum of Alberta is set on a lower floor of the building, and you access the museum from a balcony space overlooking the displays. Of particular interest to me were several naval aircraft on display that were used on aircraft carriers operated by the Canadian Navy. The last Canadian aircraft carrier, HMCS Bonaventure, was withdrawn from service in 1971, and the museum had a very nice model of this ship that had on it models of the aircraft used on this ship, including the McDonnell F-2H-3 Banshee fighter jet, one of which has been restored and is on display in the museum. This aircraft was one of 39 Banshee fighters purchased from the U.S. Navy in 1955 to fly off the Bonaventure, as it was the only jet fighter able to operate on an aircraft carrier as small as the Bonaventure. The use of jet fighters by the Canadian Navy ceased in 1962. And it is nice to see that this plane has found a home where it can be viewed by the general public. The Bonnie carried on in an anti-submarine role for several more years, using the Grumman CS-2F tracker, but in the end her days were numbered too, and she was decommissioned and scrapped in 1971. Also on display were several examples of the naval guns and turrets mounted on Canadian ships over the years. The Alberta Naval Museum does a good job displaying life in the Navy and the equipment used. On my way out, one more exhibit caught my eye. a model of HMCS Edmonton, a Kingston-class coastal defense vessel in the Canadian Navy, named after my hometown. To complete my tour of the Calgary Military Museums, it was time to turn my attention to the Air Force with a visit to the Ken and Roma Lett Cold War exhibit in a hangar by the front door of the main building. When you enter these connected hangars, you are treated to a nice collection of iconic Canadian aircraft, such as this F-86 Sabre that was the primary fighter jet of the Canadian Air Force in the 1950s. The Sabre was armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, fed by a 300-round ammunition belt each. The Sabre was replaced by the CF-104 Starfighter in 1962, and one of these aircraft are on display in the hangar as well. The CF-104 was designed as a supersonic interceptor aircraft, but was used primarily for low-level strike and reconnaissance by the RCAF. Up to 1971, the CF-104 was part of Canada's nuclear strike force and could be armed with nuclear weapons supplied by the United States in the event of an attack by the Warsaw Pact. The CF-104 Starfighter was replaced by the CF-18 Hornet beginning in 1982. All the CF-104s were retired from service with the Canadian Armed Forces by 1987, with most of the remaining aircraft being given to Turkey. Crossing over to the second hangar, we come upon a CF-18 Hornet, Canada's present jet fighter. The McDonnell Douglas CF-18 Hornet came into service with the Canadian Armed Forces in 1982. Over the years, CF-18s have conducted NORAD air sovereignty patrols, flown in the Gulf War in 1991, the Kosovo War in the late 90s, helped enforce the Libyan no-fly zone in 2011, and contributed to military action against ISIS. Also on display was one of the bombs that could be deployed from the CF-18, the Mark 82 Snake Eye 500-pound general purpose bomb. An aircraft injection seat was also on display, along with a flight simulator, and a jet turbine engine mounted on a maintenance stand. After a 4-hour visit well spent, it was time to bid farewell to the Calgary Military Museums. Well, folks, that concludes this video on what I saw at the Calgary Military Museums. The museum is wonderful and well worth the visit if you happen to be in the Calgary area. Till next time, everyone keep safe and well.